Pints with Jack, Season 4, Episode 47. After Hours with Michael Jahosky. Welcome, everyone. Pints with Jack is your weekly C.S. Lewis podcast where Matt, Andrew and I break down and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis. This season, we're eavesdropping on the correspondence of a senior demon, Screwtape, as he explains how to tempt the patient, a human assigned to be tempted by Screwtape's nephew, Wormwood. Each week, we'll be considering a different letter, untwisting Screwtape's hellish logic, and forming a battle plan for our own spiritual lives. However, today is a Thursday, and it's therefore an After Hours episode. As I mentioned on earlier shows, I'm reading through the Silmarillion this year, and I'm actually currently on chapter 21. And today, I have someone to join me on this journey through Middle-earth as I talk to Professor Michael Jahosky about his book. Professor Michael T. Jahosky teaches humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. As I was researching him, I saw that on ratemyprofessors.com he had a score of 4.2 out of 5, which seems pretty good to me. He has 2 bachelor's degrees, one in humanities and one in history from the University of Central Florida, and a master's degree in humanities from the University of South Florida. Over the course of his academic career, he has specialized in Greek, Roman, and biblical history, philosophy, theology, and the arts. In graduate school, in addition to these areas of study, he also focused on early Italian Renaissance. A few months ago, he was on the Unbelievable podcast with another former guest of the show, Dr. Holly Ordway. He is the host of Mythic Mission, a podcast and YouTube channel, and the author of the newly released book which we'll be discussing today, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel of Middle-earth, which is endorsed by another former guest of the show, Dr. Louis Marcos. Professor Michael Jahosky, welcome to Pints with Jack.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all, not at all. So, here on Pints with Jack, each episode we share a quote, a drink, and a toast. And for Christmas this year, my brother-in-law, Sam, he gave me a copy of Tolkien's collected letters. And so for the quote of the week, I thought I'd share Tolkien's own description of The Lord of the Rings, found in letter 142. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. And today, for the drink of the week, I was going to go for something more exciting, but it's a cold, wet day here in San Diego, so I'm tucked up in my hobbit hole with some hot peppermint tea. Are you drinking anything?
I am. I'm enjoying a Dogfish Head 60-minute IPA. That's the only kind of beer I drink these days. I'm enjoying it very much.
I quite like IPAs. I just find them too hoppy.
They're extremely hoppy.
I'm just not enough of a man, apparently. That's my conclusion. At least that's what my friends tell me.
Not true, sir.
Now, we don't actually have any new Patreon supporters today, so for the Patreon toast, I thought we would just toast Tolkien. So, if you'll raise your glass, to the Professor. So, to kick things off, I gave a brief biography earlier, but would you mind just filling in a few of the details, telling us a little bit more about yourself, about your interest in myth and Middle-earth?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when my interest in myth began, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that my interest in Tolkien's works began in 2001 when I was about 16 years old. This is the year that I rediscovered Christianity and discovered Tolkien's books for the first time. My brother actually turned me on to a love of the books before the movies came out. We didn't finish them before they came out, so we finished them after. And then I went and devoured the rest of the books. I think I did The Hobbit, and I read bits and pieces of the Silmarillion over probably the next decade, as it takes that long sometimes. I remember loving myth, just the incredible stories in college, and the reason I decided to major in humanities, is because I had a great professor at University of Central Florida who really was just very inspirational to me. I still keep in touch with him. He's retired now, and he's like, "Oh, you're a professor now." He's like, "This is incredible. It must be eye-opening for him." But I loved his classes, and I just knew that I wanted to share my love of knowledge and wisdom with other people. And so today I'm a humanities professor, as you already said, here in Florida at St. Petersburg College. We're a great school. We're known nationally and even internationally. We've got a great online program. So I'm happy to be involved here. And I mean, there's so much to say. I'm happily married. I've got 2 kids. They're turning 7 and 4 this March. They're both March babies. So that's exciting. And, author of this new book. Lots of things that I'm interested in, but yeah, that's a good start.
Well, the real test of your Tolkien nerddom is how fluent are you in Quenya and Sindarin?
I'm ashamed to say I never studied Elvish. I am, however, adept at filling up the corners like any good hobbit, so that I have in spades. Yeah, sorry.
I'm still waiting for the Duolingo course.
Yeah, I hear that's a great program for other languages as well. So they need to make that happen.
Dothraki, Klingon, Sindarin. That's my wish list.
Oh gosh. Yeah, this is a good bucket list too. I'll have to jump on board with you.
Now, we'll talk about your book shortly, but before we get to that, I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit about your podcast, Mythic Mission.
Thank you.
What are you doing in that podcast, and who are some of the guests that you've had on? Because I was looking through the list. There are quite a few people that I want on this show as well.
Yes. And I think we've got one, Brian Williams, who was just on the show a few episodes ago, who's written a book called C.S. Lewis Pre-Evangelism for a Post-Christian World, Why Narnia is More Real Than We Think. So that's probably the most relevant guest I've had on for your show. I think he's gotten in touch with you. I hope he comes on soon. It's an excellent book. He was an excellent guest. We had a lot of fun talking. It's one of my most popular episodes. Another one that I'm very fond of, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the show in a second, is Dr. Paul Gould, who, the previous individual I mentioned, Brian Williams, is also a PhD. Dr. Gould teaches on the other side of the coast here in Florida at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And he's got a book that I highly recommend called Cultural Apologetics. I think I've spoken to you about Paul Gould before. I've got a colleague from SPC who's got a book coming out on Greek tragedy. So I've even got somebody close to home. We talked about myth and the myths in the tragedians, works of the tragedians from classical Athens. So Dr. Matthew Sims came on the show. I've got a couple others. Devin Brown is a Tolkien scholar. And of course, Dr. Louis Marcos. How could I forget to mention him? He not only endorsed my book, but reviewed it and came on. He was our very first episode. He talked about his new book, The Myth Made Fact, which is excellent. So the podcast, as it kind of sounds, Mythic Mission is really kind of bringing you my love of an imaginative apologetic, as well as one that stimulates the intellect. So, the little blurb for the show is that I'm trying to have an apologetic that appeals to, the whole person. As a friend once told me, we need churches that preach to the whole person. And so, of course, it's much more than just the imagination and the intellect, but that's really what my show focuses on, essentially where faith and the arts intersect, especially around this concept of mythos is the Greek term, as a narrated worldview. And so I'm really interested in exploring that. That's what we're doing on the show. Cool.
Well, let's talk about your book then. The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. So how did this come about?
Yeah, so the book began as a series of journal reflections, actually. So I think I started jotting things down right when I had become initially an adjunct in 2010, 2011, which was an important year. I'll mention why later. By 2012, especially on my Christmas breaks, during Advent, I found myself just kind of wandering into Narnia and Middle-earth and taking notes on my, at the time I was actually just doodling on Microsoft Word and brain dumping a bunch of ideas. And eventually, so you might call them Tolkien pensees almost. Blaise Pascal's pensees are another favorite. So anyway, I started just journaling, and then eventually a couple years later, after I guess you could call that research, I was kind of exploring some of the intuitions I had about the Bible, the Gospel specifically, and the works of Tolkien. And by 2015, I went to my first academic conference, no less, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I presented a paper. I think it was called Tolkien's Parable, The House of David in Middle-earth. I've got to double check that. I had to scrub that title with the publisher ultimately because of the mention of his name. But I think that was the title of the paper. Paper turned into a proposal, but I pitched this abstract of mine to the publisher's booth at the conference at the hotel. And they gave me the cold shoulder. I was told this kind of happens frequently. So I was, I was very nervous. It was like, hey, here's my abstract, take a look. And maybe that had something to do with it. But a couple weeks later, they wrote in and said, we'd like a full proposal. This was my first publisher, I think McFarland, and was with them for some number of years, actually 4 years until 2019, and then had to, after the peer review, I think they decided it was going in too Christian a direction. Initially, they knew it was a Christian and specifically Catholic kind of, subject, but I think it became too persuasive, more like an apologetic, that they didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually I ended up with Whipfenstock through the help of some friends and some new friends and lots of networking. Finally got a publisher for my book, and then finally published again in September of 2020. So quite a road.
Quite a road.
Yeah.
And I got to say, I really did enjoy your book. I
Thank you.
felt that it really deserved to be read slowly.
Mm.
You described it in the introduction as you wanted it to be red beef and strong beer. And I think that's definitely true. And another thing that I found really helpful were the videos that were on your YouTube channel as you did a group study going through the book.
Thank you. Yes. That was kind of the first foray of videos that we did. And that was prior to the podcast's inception, which really kicked off in the 2021 year. I'm glad you found them helpful, and I'm honored that you read and enjoyed the book. So, yeah.
Well, I'll make sure I put up a page on our blog with all the videos. So when someone's reading it, they just know one place that they get to go to.
A study guide, yes.
Yeah. And I do really like it when books are launched with that kind of material. There was one put out a couple of years ago on the theology of the Jerusalem temple, and they launched a podcast and a video series and all this kind of other stuff alongside it. So you basically had a companion through the book. I mean, one of the things
incredible.
What we do here with Pints with Jack is we will just discuss the book and move through it, so that as you're reading it, you get to do it in community, even if you're at a research station in Antarctica.
It's a great idea. And, it is kind of a homegrown version. It's not professionally edited, but, that's because I'm kind of my own publicist. And, my sister is kind of helping a little bit on the side, and she's gotten quite busy, but she's got some plans for later in the year to kind of get the book even more out there. So as I said, this was a first attempt to kind of get something going that people could hang on to in case they needed a little extra help. Yeah. So it sounds like a good direction for authors to go in so that people can get the most out of their book.
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, what would you say your book is about?
Yeah, I've struggled with this because there's so many important points that I would want to communicate to the reader and to my audience in general, whether you're getting introduced to my book through one of my videos or a podcast, or if you actually pick up my book and just dive right in. I would say the back cover does a great job, as all back covers do. But here's one point from early in the book I can read from, I think, page 23 of the Kindle edition. And I quote myself here saying this: "If everything in reality in some way points to Jesus Christ, the incarnation, then the best possible way to communicate that would be through a type of communication that is in form what it wants to say in content, that is, i.e. kind of an incarnational form of communication." And so that's kind of the book in a nutshell, is that how Tolkien communicated the Christian worldview was very important to him on his own scale of significance. As many scholars have pointed out, this was number one on his list. And yet I found so many Tolkien scholars that said very, kind of ambiguously, well, it is and it isn't a Christian book. And I'm like, well, it either is or it isn't. Maybe we just don't understand how it is. And so I've tried to unpack that in my book, how Tolkien communicated the Christian worldview. And I found a remarkable essay. Here's one last thing I tack on to this in a nutshell, is Tolkien's Art of the Parable. It's an essay by Father Robert Murray. He was a Jesuit friend of Tolkien's who was a correspondent in many of the letters that you mentioned your brother-in-law, I think, got you. You can find that he spoke to him frequently. And he wrote this for the Tolkien Centenary in 1992. And I think it was a sermon initially, then it became an essay. And that really kind of unlocked it for me. And so I said to myself, I need to develop what Murray started and really focus on the how. How did Tolkien get his Christian vision across without violating the reader's ability to figure it out for him or herself? And so that's what the book is about.
Well, let's move through the book. I think we're going to spend more time on the introduction and chapter 1, because as I was working through it, those were the key bits that I kept coming back to. And once I felt like I'd really started to grasp that material, everything else started to fall into place.
Yes.
So in the preface, you talk about your road into Jerusalem. What was this?
Yeah, so I know you'll know this, David, that this was C.S. Lewis's essay, Christianity and Culture. You may be familiar with it, you may not, but it's from the compilation Christian Reflections. And he has a quote in there I'd like to share. He says, if for some, culture may be a road into Jerusalem, for others it may not be. Imitation may pass into initiation. And so I read this much later in my research journey for the book. I think it was sometime after my trip to Jerusalem, believe it or not, in probably the years 2016 to 2019. And as I look back on, at that point, so many years, well over 15 years of my spiritual journey, I kind of realized that Tolkien helped me hear the gospel for the first time, or in a way that I was really getting the true gospel. Because my rediscovery of Christianity, the same year I discovered Tolkien, I was buying into kind of a prosperity gospel, Joyce Meyer, Joel Osteen, which I didn't know at the time was bad Christianity. And so, and it really is. So, as I was just looking back and after reading this essay, I kind of realized this was a very apropos image for my road into Jerusalem. Is that the Lord of the Rings was it. My road into Jerusalem, my journey to faith, it helped me understand Christianity better. I talk about this in the book frequently, and it kind of just tied it all together for me. And so that's why I entitled it that. And of course, my spiritual journey is given there in full. There's a lot of moving parts, but I don't know if you want me to get into that at all.
No, let's keep pressing on, because there's a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about.
I know.
But
yes.
I will say, this is the thing I really enjoyed about your book, because although it's a book about Tolkien, Lewis appears an awful lot. And
he does.
He helps unpack a lot of the stuff that you talk about. And just that idea of this road into Jerusalem or road out of Jerusalem, and Tolkien communicating his Christianity through his work. As soon as I put this in terms of getting past watchful dragons, everything started to make sense to me. And Indeed. I would just say that whereas some people criticize Narnia, and we are going to talk about Narnia, for its so-called crudity, I will definitely say that Tolkien, in his way of getting past watchful dragons, is infinitely subtler in such a way that I will still bump into people that have no idea as to the background of Tolkien, that they had no idea that this was someone that took his faith really seriously and thought this work was, as I said in the quote of the week, an essentially spiritual and religious work. Yes,
I quite agree. I mean, he does have a much more suggestive and elusive way of communicating the gospel. And, I'd like to delve more into the Narnia series about this as well. But, there are moments, I should say, in the Narnia books where Lewis does this, approximating as well as I think Tolkien did it. But I do say that, Tolkien does it a lot better, more consistently. There are moments where the cracks in the story really appear and become quite wide in the Narnia books. And so you can kind of see right through to what they're, gesturing toward. But yes, I think it's a great image. For many of us, there are things in culture that get us thinking about bigger ideas and something transcendent. We start wondering maybe there's something more to life, and it wasn't quite that way for me because I was already kind of interested in Christianity, but it opened up the Christian faith more, and so it can do that as well. But Lewis does say that for some it is a good beginning. For others, we have a road out of Jerusalem. Culture can draw us away from the faith. So he does say there's another side to that sword.
And one thing I will say in defense of Lewis is I would expect Tolkien's to be a little bit more smooth and a little bit more refined, because the guy took decades to write the book. My boy Jack was knocking out the Chronicles of Narnia about one a year.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm getting defensive.
Yeah.
So
no, it's good. It's true, though. It's true. Yeah. Well, I'd love to have that conversation maybe again in the future. Yeah.
You have quite a substantial introduction to your book. It's a little shy of 50 pages.
Yes.
What are the key things that the reader really needs to grasp before they delve into the body of the book?
I think one of the big pushbacks I had when publishing the book is that I wanted to make this a whole nother chapter. So I would encourage the reader to take heart. The introduction is very important. It is long. Treat it as a chapter in and of itself. There are several concepts and terms that we need to kind of unpack in the introduction before making the case that I want to make in chapter 1 especially about the literary form that the Lord of the Rings is, that can help us understand how Christianity is being communicated. So of those concepts, there of course is the concept of myth, which I'll speak to in a moment. I talk about types, antitypes, archetypes, typology in general as a way of interpreting scripture very early on in the introduction. I mention allegory, although that's mainly saved for chapter 1, and I mention parable and metaphor and these other literary concepts that are also more chapter 1, which we'll get to. And fairy story, of course, gets a mention. So I kind of set the stage, as any good introduction does. These are ideas that pop up again. But other ideas that I'd like to mention is that I like to address in the introduction for readers to know about and listeners here is that I try to also talk about the relationship between Christianity and other religions. Or if you understand religions as a myth, what we're saying is, these other religions have narrated worldviews. They have certain ways of looking at the world. And this was of great importance to both Tolkien and Lewis, and it was Tolkien that helped impress this upon Lewis in 1931, where I think he went on to write an essay that had this theme that really stimulated him to return to Christianity. And that was all thanks to Tolkien's way of looking at myth. And so I do spend a lot of time unpacking that. So, myth for Tolkien and Lewis was something like a grand narrative or a narrated worldview, a true statement, a true story is the ancient understanding of it. And that's really how they understood it. But this gets very complicated philosophically from this point, of simplicity, this departure point. There's more detail and nuance to it. But this at least did tell the theistic Lewis, who, I think he'd become a theist in 1930 at this point, that myths are not lies like he thought. And it opened up a lot of new doors for him. So I think there's going to be a lot of people who read my book who are in that same boat as Lewis was. So I talk about that. I talk about the relationship between Christianity and other religions, because I know that I've had a lot of pushback from folks who say, oh, well, you say the Lord of the Rings is a Christian book. Well, what does that mean for the Scandinavian elements and the Anglo-Saxon elements and the Greco-Roman elements and the Jewish elements? Not even, well, okay, that's Judeo-Christian, but okay, I see your point. I address that because I think it is important that the reader has that. So we delve into some of that as well. And I think that pretty much covers what I would say are the most important parts. And then last but not least, I would say one last thing might be important, although it comes up frequently throughout the rest of the book, is the perspective we take in the book will surprise readers. I'm starting with The Lord of the Rings and looking back to the prequel books. So we start with The Lord of the Rings, actually start with The New Shadow, which many people don't know this, but Tolkien has an abandoned sequel to The Lord of the Rings. Then we go to The Lord of the Rings. We then go to The Hobbit, and then back to the Silmarillion and the debate of Finrod and Andreth and other short stories and unfinished tales. And we look retrospectively through the mythology of Tolkien's, because he gives sort of credence to this in his own letters, where he talks about the references to the distant past in The Lord of the Rings as part of its appeal, he says in one letter. And he compares it to something like seeing an island glittering on the distance. And if we sail directly to it, we will ruin the magic. We will spoil the enchantment. We have to be careful about that. So I think that would be the last thing that I kind of established for readers in that very substantial, introduction. Yeah.
The bit that I particularly liked was the section where you spoke about finding truth outside of Christianity. This is actually one of, I think, Lewis's most winsome points in Mere Christianity. He says that to accept Christianity means that you actually don't have to say that all other religions are entirely wrong.
That's right.
In fact, one of the arguments for Christianity is that it has explanatory power. It can explain the truth that you find elsewhere. Lewis speaks about God sending the pagans good dreams, which was basically the myths that they would tell. And this was a similar idea that I was actually first introduced by the early church fathers when they spoke about despoiling the Egyptians, that anything that is true comes from the Logos. Christ is the Logos. Therefore, anything true that is found in non-Christian religions is rightfully the property of us Christians. And they quite gleefully went and took anything that they saw as having truth, goodness, and beauty. They baptized it and then brought it into the faith and then put it to the service of the faith.
That's right. And I agree. And I think for the reader or listener here that might be concerned about the assertiveness and exclusivity of that statement, that it belongs to us. That when a Christian says that, we're not saying it belongs to we Christians, but to God. It belongs to God. All types in reality point to God. Some participate and point to and participate in God more than others, but they all belong to Him. And as for the exclusivity, every culture, every narrative, every religion, however you want to put it, has exclusive terms, and that's not something we can avoid. So it's a myth in the modern sense of that, the way we understand myth, as a false narrative that we can somehow avoid exclusivity. So I address that too, because we think we're being tolerant by saying that, well, everybody can have their cake and eat it, or everybody can have their own true religion, true for them. And I'm like, well, no, that's not how truth works. And well, what do you mean that's not how truth works? Well, let's think about it. And I walk you through that. At least I try my best to. And of course, standing on the shoulders of Tolkien and Lewis there, who did this in a wonderfully winsome way, as you said. Lewis, according to one Lewis scholar, Charlie W. Starr, he said that Lewis said he would not have become a Christian had it meant rejecting the truth, goodness, and beauty that he found as an atheist in other religions. He just never would have made the transition, thanks to Hugo Dyson and Tolkien that September evening in 1931.
Mm. And one of the things I've heard you say is that if somebody says that might be true for you, is really just another way of saying that's not true.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, if it's all subjective, then it's it's like using little bean counters. I mean, little checkers. That they don't mean anything. We're just exchanging. I think I'm drawing on Lewis in a meditation in a tool shed who says something like that. That's it. It's just about feelings and not facts. So it's another way of saying it's not true. Yeah.
Now, after the introduction, your book is broken up into 5 parts, and the first is called The Lord of the Rings as Parable.
Yeah.
And you break down a bunch of terms related to allegory. And I was originally going to ask you what they were, but I'm actually going to make an attempt to try and tell you what I think you're saying, and you can tell me where I go wrong.
Yeah, sure.
You basically argue that allegory is a big umbrella, because we've got a kind of complicated situation whereby Tolkien said that he didn't like allegory, and in other places he then says that Lord of the Rings is an allegory. So allegory is a very broad term to denote any kind of writing where one thing is pointing to, in some respect, to something else. And that appears on a spectrum, on a continuum. And so at one end, you've got the very clear, very intentional allegory, where it's a one-to-one relationship, and it's also kind of obvious. I'm thinking of something like, say, The Pilgrim's Progress. If somebody is called despair, well, then they're about despair. It's nothing too clever.
No.
But then at the other end, you've got fairy tales and parables, which are much more suggestive. And the comparison that I also liked, you compared raw allegory to metaphor. Allegory is, again, pointing in this sense like a one-to-one relationship, whereas metaphor is much more suggestive. What Lewis would refer to in his works as the kappa element, in particular, when he's talking about an environment, a certain feeling.
Yes.
And we mentioned Dr. Ward's work, Planet Narnia, earlier. This is the entire point of Planet Narnia, that Lewis, through his very careful use of language and image, is trying to evoke the atmosphere, the feelings of the spiritual symbols of the of the medieval cosmos. How did I do?
You did fantastic. Yeah, I think that I'll just kind of add on a few things, but I wouldn't change a thing about how you said it. And, I had read Dr. Ward's book prior to writing my book. At some point in the years, I was, neck deep in books. But I don't think it made its way into my bibliography because I didn't have time to look into some of the references, especially in early chapters of that book that I knew were helpful. And so it's been fun revisiting that book and seeing how many points of contact there are between the research that he's done and drawing on that kappa element in romance that you mentioned, which later I think was dubbed a new title for that it had a new name later on. That essay was renamed. And I've been reading it, and I'm thinking, this is great. Lewis and Tolkien had their mind set on this. They wanted to make it Christian. They wanted you to have breathing Christian air, but without thinking that you were. So yeah, I think what can I add here? So I would say that yes, of course, when you say that the Lord of the Rings is an allegory, as I do, and that there's nothing to fear from this, most people who are just even cursory, familiarity with the term, or with Tolkien studies, they'll say, oh my God. Well, when you actually look at the letters of Tolkien, I think it's letter, I want to say 187. I have to double check here. I have it somewhere, but one of the 180s, he says, my work is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power exerted for domination, something to that extent. And it was pointed out by a couple of Tolkien scholars, actually, that I read, one of which was Joseph Pierce, who, said, hey, look, it is an allegory. It's just not the kind that he disliked. So I'm not the first to point this out, but I think I'm the first to sort of say there's a spectrum, maybe not the first to say that so much, but that there are subtle interactions between, as we'll get to, the difference between metaphorical language and allegorical language. This is where it gets a little bit more nuanced, that I can add to this in a moment. But yes, I think we have on one end of this spectrum, we can hypothesize the conscious and intentional. The crude allegory goes by many names, where I would say the entire composition is dominated by the allegorical mode, which is actually more akin to direct language, more like logos and less like mythos. It's very transparent to the reality that it wants to portray. You're reading a Christian story. Mm-hmm. There's just no way around it. On the other end, you have the fairy story or the parable. Now, why am I making that connection? Well, because one of Tolkien's good friends and confidants made it first. He said that we can find many examples in the fairy story of Tolkien, the art of the parable, Murray said. And so we can find many examples of the art of the parable. And he goes on to explain what some of those are and compares them to the parables of Jesus. And I said, well, let's explore what biblical scholars say about the form of the parable and the fairy story. And I found that those two kind of belong at the other end of the spectrum. And the way I break it down in my book is that if, Tolkien says The Lord of the Rings is an allegory, or a kind of allegory, he also says that The Lord of the Rings is a fairy story. That means that a fairy story could be rightly classified as a type of allegory, opposite the conscious one that he didn't like. Now, I'll quote Jane Chance, I think, who says that, Tolkien's thought was very complex. This is a Tolkien scholar, Jane Chance. She wrote a book about Tolkien some years ago. As he often did in Persian, she says Tolkien is trying to say several things at the same time, often appearing to contradict himself. Professor Clyde Kilby had once labeled this as Tolkien's proclivity for contrasistency, this insistent or consistent ability for him to contradict himself. And that is so true when it comes to allegory. It's an incredibly nuanced term. So yeah, that's I think good. David, if you don't mind, I'll point out one thing I'd add here is the difference between the allegorical mode and the metaphorical mode. Although you already kind of hinted at it, the metaphorical mode is more suggestive, as you said. The allegorical is less suggestive, more direct. It reminds you of what you already know. The metaphorical mode is more implicit. It suggests a connection, but it doesn't exactly spell it out. And so typically most people think of metaphor as substitutionary speech. It's an expendable substitute for literal language. That's not my understanding of metaphor, or many biblical scholars for that matter. Metaphor is kind of suggesting an inner animation between two thoughts, a suggestive implicit connection, not an exact one-for-one, which is the kind that Tolkien really wanted to avoid. So I think there needs to be a more nuanced understanding of metaphor for readers who are probably going to collapse a lot of these terms together. I don't think that people are aware of how much hair-splitting scholars have done over these terms, which is really what we're doing, isn't it? So that's one other thing I could say, and I'll stop there for now.
Well, I now want to apply some of this to Narnia. Because This is what I was thinking about while I was thinking of another book while I was reading yours.
Of course.
Because I actually thought this provided some really good language to talk about Narnia and to explain some people's reactions to it. Because I would argue that Lewis's supposal, he said that Narnia wasn't an allegory, quote unquote, but that it was a supposal. What if the second person of the Trinity, what if he made a world and came to redeem it, and that was a world of talking animals? What would that be like? And the way I thought about a supposal is it has at least one very clear allegorical element. Here, that's Aslan. Aslan is the Son. He is Jesus. But that everything else that's around that is largely metaphorical. So although he uses a very strong allegorical element, the work as a whole doesn't necessarily therefore fall into the genre of allegory.
Mm-mm. Agreed.
And
Agreed.
And then I would double down to then talk about The Magician's Nephew and The Last Battle, because they have a very similar kind of element. It's got a very key allegorical signal. The Magician's Nephew, everybody talks about it as Narnia's creation story, and that immediately takes you to Genesis. That is a very short, that's a very short trip that you make between those two books. And likewise with The Last Battle, that is Narnia's apocalypse. It's the book of Revelation. And so once again, you have a very strong allegorical element. That tool is used, but that the stories themselves are suffused with metaphor and lots of other things that are suggestive, that aren't just a straight, simple one-to-one relationship. Even say in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, although it's a parallel to Jesus' crucifixion,
sure,
detail after detail, no, it's different. It's not quite the same.
No, it's not.
And so this is my explanation as to why a lot of people call Narnia allegory, and I think it's not true, not in the genre sense that they're thinking.
No, I quite agree. And Lewis was very emphatic that it isn't. And I think both Tolkien and Lewis in various places, and I can't track down in my mind exactly where, I think it was in the introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Sir Orfeo and Pearl, that Tolkien did, where he talks about the fact that you can find the allegorical mode in a composition doesn't make the entire composition an allegory. Allegorical language, or even using allegorical language to interpret a story, so whether in making or interpreting a story, is not it's inevitable. Tolkien says in a letter, you can't interpret a metaphor without metaphorical language itself. So that's something actually that he says, as I said in a letter. It's unavoidable. So I think this is an excellent way to apply this to Narnia, and I would say that another way that we might put this, is in typical understanding, as I said, of metaphor, is this substitution theory that assumes that metaphor is just another way of saying what can be said literally. Well, if you're trying to tell a story that everybody already knows, like the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, then you want to use that kind of metaphor. That's the traditional understanding of metaphor, which is actually more what allegorical means in my understanding, that in my research has yielded. And if you want to tell a story like that, and some have leveled that Lewis has, I don't think that's entirely correct, then that's what you do. But if you want to do more than just give a fresh spin, as one scholar has put it, on worn out literal language, this is one author I drew on who wrote a book about George MacDonald's writings, and she said this, then you want to use that understanding of metaphor as suggestive speech. If you want to show something new in the supposal, imagine that Jesus were a lion in this world called Narnia. Just pretend for a second, right? Imagine that. This understanding of metaphor allows us to open up new understandings and insights about who Jesus is by seeing him as a lion. And so with that, I want to say it's a new understanding of metaphor, but I think biblical scholars have been working with this for some time. It's new for me. With that understanding of metaphor, it's not just a substitution for what can be said literal. The metaphor is the message. And that's very key to understanding both my book and I think, books about Narnia and the Narnia books themselves.
And I want to talk about the rest of the book, but one thing I do want to say first, as you were describing that, I was also put in mind of Andrew's favorite book, Till We Have Faces.
Oh, yes.
And that book, I would say, is all suggestion. There is the Christian story in there somewhere, and Christians read that book and they can tell it's in there, but they can't quite put their finger on the elements very clearly. There's certainly the idea of a sacrifice. There's an idea of the God of love. There's the idea of the soul and beauty. But it seems like a familiar story, but it's different and weird.
Exactly.
And it keeps evoking stuff in you, but you're not quite sure why or where it's going.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I'm suggesting about Tolkien's books as well.
Now, in the second section of your book, you claim that parables are good news stories. Why are they?
So when we think about parables as good news stories, okay, well, we have to ask, what is the good news? And when we look at what the Bible says, what Jesus himself says in Mark 1:15, he identifies the gospel as good news. That is literally what Godspell means, of course, in Old English. Good story, good tidings, good news. When we ask as Christians, what is this good news? Is it that Jesus is divine? Well, the English scholar N.T. Wright was very formative to my understanding of all this. And the way I read his books, it kind of opened up this new way of understanding scripture. And he points out that we're asking the wrong question and looking for the wrong thing when we're looking to identify what this good news is. The Gospels treat this idea of Jesus' divinity as presupposition. That's not the real point. That's not what the incarnation really means. What does that look like? He says it looks like God becoming king. He also, if you've read any of Wright's books, he talks, like many New Testament scholars, about the already and the not yet. So I would say that when we look at the parables of Jesus, by seeing that C.H. Dodd's famous, already, well, he's one scholar who spoke of the already and not yet, quite a bit. When we see that already but not yet element, that present and future tension in Christianity in Jesus's own parables, then we now have this measuring stick to what constitutes a Christian story. And you can clearly find those in Jesus's parables, and I argue you can find them in all over all of Tolkien's books, but especially The Lord of the Rings is filled with these elements of already and not yet. And I would also argue that that's tied to, as I said initially, the idea of God becoming king, that's what the incarnation means. That's what it really looks like. That's what we need to wrap our mind around, that God is here. He's setting things to rights. He's making all things new. And so I explore what that means in chapter 2, what it means to understand that already and not yet element of Christianity and how it's connected to the good news, and then how we can see it in the Bible and how we can see it in Tolkien's books. And I'll give you an example. Towards the end of The Return of the King, the one volume edition that I have on Kindle is page 963. It's the Steward and the King chapter, for those you nerds out there like me who know exactly what I'm referring to. You think of the eagle singing over Minas Tirith. He's coming back and he says, "Sing now, you people of the Tower of Anor, for the realm of Sauron is ended forever, and the Dark Tower is thrown down. Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of the Guard, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken, and your king hath passed through, and he is victorious." And this is the best part. "Sing and be glad, all ye children of the West, for your king shall come again, and he shall dwell among you all the days of your life. And the tree that was withered shall be renewed. He shall plant it in the high places, and the city shall be blessed. Sing, all you people." And the people sang in all the ways of the city, we're told. This is the heart of the good news. And it's also when we find out, more about what Aragorn is doing in that chapter. He finds the sapling with Gandalf. He gets married. He's coronated. We see all these. The kingdom is established, but it's still a sad world. It's still a broken world. It's not yet fully consummated. And I could spend the rest of our time just talking about these good news / already not yet elements. But why is it good news? I would say one final word. I would say that it's good news because many people think of Christianity as a disembodied faith about preaching about a whole new world that we're going to go to, that we're going to get rid of this one. And that's not what the gospel is about. It's good news because the real understanding of the Christian story tells us that there is suffering, there is sorrow, that joy in this life is partial, not yet full. And I think that will surprise people, and it will be good news, but that things are going to be made right again. I know, and Sam says, are all sad things going to come untrue? And the answer is yes. And that is what I mean in chapter 2. So we explore that in that chapter.
Well, in chapter 1, you said that The Lord of the Rings is a parable, and in chapter 2, you said that parables are good news stories. And so in the third section of your book, you complete the syllogism. You say that The Lord of the Rings is good news. And now you laid out some of it there. What else would you unpack from that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that Aristotelian sense when I was writing it, but I was thinking clearly there's some logic to this, and I love that you put it that way, because that's what I think I was going for instinctively. So it's great. It's great to be understood. That somebody picks up on that. So thank you. I would say, what else is there left to say? That just emphasizing that the Lord of the Rings is good news, that there are elements in that novel that point to this already but not yet element that pervades the Gospels and that pervades the entire Bible. That this this template that we have established already in the previous chapter can be seen poking its way through the narrative if you have eyes to see. And Tolkien even says this in a letter to his friend Father Robert Murray that I've mentioned several times. He says he's kept allusions to the highest matters down to mere hints. That's the way of the parable. So if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you'll see that. You'll see, like Paul's 1 Corinthians 15, Christ has to keep on reigning until all enemies are put under his feet, and the last enemy to be defeated is death. You'll see that element in the appendices even of the Lord of the Rings. You'll see it everywhere. And in several interviews I've been doing over the last half year, I've been asked this question. There's just so many examples I would give, but in chapter 3, that's what I'm doing. I will say, for those of you that are listening and maybe haven't heard of my book for the first time, I'm not giving a comprehensive treatment of all the characters and events of the whole mythology. I really focus on the monarchical figure of Aragorn. And so I really spent a lot of time unpacking that. How can we see that exodus reditus, the exile and returning king, and how does that say the good news, and what does that have to do with this way of understanding the good news as the already and not yet story? And so I really just am kind of picking up the insights from the previous chapters and tying it up in a bow, or tying it up in a present and putting a bow on it in chapter 3. That's what we're doing.
And in both chapters 3 and 4, you take a tour of Tolkien's complete corpus. Right. The New Shadow, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and we also chase the story of Thorin, always looking at these kingly elements.
Yes.
And I actually think you could have very easily produced a trilogy of books looking at the kingly, the priestly, and the prophetic
of course
imagery throughout all of them. But your fifth and final section is simply Estelle.
Mm-hmm.
And I like this title because it weeds out the casual Tolkien fans from the diehards.
That's right.
Separating the elves from the orcs, so to speak. So, so why did you name that final part of your book after Aragorn II, son of Arathorn II, 16th chieftain of the Dunedain of the North, later crowned king, Elessar, the 26th king of Arnor, the 35th king of Gondor, and the first high king of Gondor and Arnor since the reign of Isildur?
To give his proper name, of course.
I'm proving.
Yes.
I'm demonstrating my nerd credentials. I just want people to know what a lucky woman Marie is for managing to find me.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not alone in that. Yes, so it's a wonderful final chapter. And just a quick word about chapter 4. I spend time talking about the way Thorin prefigures typologically the character of Aragorn in of course, the Lord of the Rings, and so I spend time connecting the dots there. And it's very important that we see that Tolkien, I think, had this vision as well, because in The Quest of Erebor, which is an unfinished tale, he has Gimli scratching his chin, kind of thinking about how all of this, in his words, is strangely woven together. Strangely woven together. Very strangely indeed, he says. That how all the events have kind of, woven together to produce this ability for Aragorn to return as king. And so I go back to the very beginnings of Middle-earth in this chapter to talk about the messianic hope for the incarnation in Middle-earth. And it is Christopher Tolkien himself who said that he thinks that this was his father's most, theological works. It's Dr. Bradley J. Berzer has said in his book on Tolkien that this is a mythical presentation of the incarnation in the debate of Finrod and Andrath. And so I spent a lot of time talking about the Silmarillion and the debate of Finrod and Andrath. For those of you that don't know, it's a conversation that takes place in the First Age between Galadriel's brother, Finrod, and Andrath, who's like a woman of the race of men. She's kind of like a seer, I think, of a wise woman who actually also has affections for Finrod and that are unrequited. But anyway, they have a conversation, very Job-like, that among many other topics, just FYI, they talk about Estelle, which is, of course, the name that Aragorn's mother Gilraen gives to her son. It's the code name for Aragorn, right? It means hope. And we find out that when we go back to the debate of Finrod and Andrath, Tolkien had written this late 1950s dialogue that produces this hope. It was already the old hope in the First Age, which says a lot, meaning it's even goes back to the beginning of time, that one day Iluvatar, God, will enter the creation as a painter does his picture, as an author does his story. And I kind of connect that with parable I know it's really interesting. I want to give your listeners this fun fact. In my research of the Semitic linguistic origins of the word mashal, which is Hebrew for proverb, parable, riddle. This is the word that when we translate out of the Hebrew into the Greek, parabolane or parabole, right, where we get the word parable, the Hebrew equivalent is mashal. Well, mashal has history going back to meaning something like reign, a king's reign, the rule of God or the rule of his son, the king on earth. And it's a very peculiar thing, but it was astounding to learn that. And so I tie all that together in chapter 5, and I show that there is a hope for the incarnation, that we can understand, despite Tolkien's words in his letters, that we have to understand the incarnation a certain way or not look for it in Middle-earth. I present a good case that we can, and that we might have misunderstood what he meant by that, and that the incarnation is understood how God became king, and that we can see it reflected parabolically in Middle-earth is really what it amounts to saying. And that's the final chapter of the book. And I try to tie together all the arguments that I've put forward. And so, we've obviously leapfrogged over quite a bit. I hope people will read it and see it for themselves. And there's a lot left that I haven't connected. So,
but I think you have backed up something that Father Dwight Longenecker said on an earlier episode, that for Lent, more people should read The Lord of the Rings. That should be their spiritual reading.
That's great. Yeah, that's good to hear. I think so. It is a deeply Catholic and deeply, more broadly, Christian book.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about your book. Where can people go to find out more about you, listen to the podcast, and pick up a copy of the book?
Sure. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel for Mythic Mission, Anchor, iTunes. You can find me on every famous podcast station that you like to listen to. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, all social media, Instagram. I also have a blog on WordPress. I know you'll be releasing some of those details with the show. So I'm all over the place. I'm easy to find these days.
And you fortunately have a very unique last name, which makes you easy to find.
Yes, indeed.
Which is how I could tell your teacher's rating.
Yeah, and my book is also available on Amazon, so it's easy to pick up there.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks to all of our top-tier supporters, Gary, Jake, Stephen, Matt, Jeff, Chris, John, James, Kate, and Rowdy. If you gave up alcohol for Lent, why not make your first dram of scotch extra tasty by picking up a laser-etched Pints with Jack glass at our store? You can find it on our website, pintswithjack.com, which, by the way, is going to be getting a facelift in a month or two. It's my current project. And please share everything on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, MySpace. That's right, we're still bringing it back. And please join us next time when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.